when my son looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, this house isn't yours anymore. Dad left me everything, $40 million. You need to go." I felt the floor vanish beneath me. I packed my bags like the dutiful mother I had always been, walking out with nothing but silence in my throat. But 48 hours later, I was no longer the woman they tossed aside. I was the one holding a secret that would flip their world upside down. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're tuning in from, because trust me, this isn't just a story about money. It's about betrayal, justice, and how sometimes the person you think is powerless is the one moving all the pieces on the board. I still remember the way the clock ticked that night, too loud in a house that suddenly felt strange to me. My husband had only been gone a week and grief was still sitting heavy on my chest, pressing down on every breath. I thought we were gathering at the dining table to talk about arrangements, maybe even share some quiet comfort, but instead I found myself staring at a son I barely recognized. Nathan sat across from me, his wife Chloe beside him, both looking far too composed for a family in mourning. And then Nathan said the words that cracked my world open. "Mom, this house isn't yours anymore. Dad left me everything, $40 million. You need to find somewhere else to stay." It felt like my ears betrayed me. 40 million? Everything? I searched his face for some sign of a joke, some shred of kindness that might soften the cruelty. But there was nothing. His tone wasn't angry or conflicted. It was cold, transactional, like he was negotiating with a stranger. Chloe's lips curled into something between a smirk and a shrug, and then she slid a small envelope across the polished wood. "To get started," she said, as if she were doing me some grand favor. I didn't even have the strength to touch it. The envelope sat there mocking me. A few $1,000s to erase decades of sacrifice, decades of being a wife, a mother, the woman who had held this family together. I felt my stomach twist, not just at the rejection but at the speed of it. My husband had been dead for days, not years, and already my son was speaking of me as though I were a burden to be cleared away. I thought of the nights I stayed awake rocking Nathan through fevers, the years I worked part-time jobs so he could attend the schools he wanted, the vacations we never took because we believed in his future. Was that all reduced to an awkward line at the end of a conversation? Find somewhere else to stay? The room seemed to close in on me. The house I had cooked in, laughed in, grieved in, it suddenly felt foreign, claimed by people who were eager to see me gone. I tried to steady my voice, tried to remind myself that surely there was some misunderstanding, that my husband would never have cut me out so completely. But Nathan's eyes hardened the moment I opened my mouth. "Mom," he said as if rehearsed, "this isn't up for debate. Dad wanted me to take care of things and you'll be fine. Chloe and I agreed it's best for everyone if you find a smaller place." Chloe's hand slid across his arm like she was rewarding a child for good behavior. She leaned forward and added, "You'll be happier somewhere simpler. Less to worry about." Happier? I wanted to laugh, but the sound would not come. I could only feel the sting of being erased, a lifetime of love reduced to a line item on a ledger. The betrayal wasn't just in the words, it was in the ease with which they said them, like they had rehearsed this scene and were simply executing a plan. The envelope remained on the table and I could almost hear it whisper, "Here's your exit fee. Don't let the door hit you on the way out." I thought of how little that money was compared to what they had claimed, 40 million. It wasn't even a rounding error. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. My own son, my flesh and blood, had decided I was expendable. Not just expendable, unwanted. I sat in silence because words seemed too fragile to stand against the cruelty of that moment. My mind spun with questions. Was it true? Did my husband really leave me with nothing? Was this cold eviction his choice, or was something else at play? Nathan spoke with such certainty, but certainty could be rehearsed. Certainty could be false. And still I couldn't escape the ache of wondering, if it was true, why hadn't my husband told me? Why had I been left to learn this in such a brutal, humiliating way? I forced myself to breathe slowly, even as my chest felt like it might shatter. Nathan rose from the table, gathering his phone, already done with the conversation. Chloe lingered just long enough to offer one last piece of poison disguised as kindness. "We'll give you a week to move out." "That's generous." Then she pressed the envelope closer to me and followed him out of the room. The silence they left behind was unbearable. I looked around the dining room, every corner filled with memories of a life I thought was secure, and realized they were already stripping it from me in their minds. My chair scraped against the hardwood as I stood, and I found myself wandering through the house like a ghost. My husband's chair at the head of the table, the photographs lining the walls, the smell of his cologne still lingering in our bedroom. It all felt stolen not by strangers, but by the very people I had once believed were my future. I picked up the envelope, fingers trembling, and carried it upstairs to my room. I didn't open it. I didn't want to see the paltry bills that would remind me just how little I was worth to them. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching it like evidence of a crime. That night I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the echoes of Nathan's voice, wondering how a child I raised with love could turn into someone so cold. And yet, even through the fog of pain, something inside me stirred. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was there. A thought that perhaps all was not as final as it seemed. If Nathan was so certain, then certainty was where I had to begin. Was this truly my husband's will? Did everything legally belong to Nathan, or was I being manipulated, pushed out before I had time to question? The injustice of it burned hotter than the grief, and beneath my heartbreak, a seed of resolve began to take root. I didn't know how or when, but I knew this wasn't the end of my story. $40 million might have been the weapon they used to discard me, but they were about to learn something Nathan and Chloe had forgotten. I was still his mother. And mothers don't disappear quietly. 2 days later, the world they thought they controlled would turn upside down. I was not in my home but in a run-down motel that smelled of mildew and cheap disinfectant. The kind of place where the curtains never fully close, and the carpet tells stories you'd rather not hear. My suitcase sat open in the corner, half-packed, half-forgotten, as if even it couldn't accept this as real. I hadn't touched the envelope Chloe had pushed toward me. It lay in the drawer beside the bed, its silence louder than any insult. A few $1,000s to erase me. To them, I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a liability they wanted gone. I lay there replaying every sacrifice that had carried Nathan to this moment, every fork in the road where I chose him over myself. The double shifts at the hospital, the jewelry I pawned to keep him in private school, the credit cards maxed out to pay off his business loans. I told myself then it was worth it, that one day he'd succeed and I'd be proud. And maybe in some corner of my heart I thought he'd look back and say, "I know what you did for me, Mom. Thank you." But gratitude never came. Instead, I was repaid with eviction papers disguised as kindness. Chloe's voice haunted me almost more than Nathan's. "You'll be happier somewhere simpler." The audacity of that line played on repeat in my head. Happier? In this motel room with a buzzing air conditioner and a bathroom sink that coughed rust? Happier, stripped of the home where I buried my husband, happier stripped of the life I had built with my own hands? Chloe had wanted me gone from the beginning. My friends warned me. They saw the way she looked at me, the way she curled her lip when I brought casseroles to family dinners. To her, I was low-class baggage, an inconvenient reminder that Nathan's success wasn't born out of thin air. It was built on my back. The cruelest part was how easily Nathan parroted her disdain. The boy I had once rocked through fevered nights now sat across from me at a polished table, telling me to go find somewhere else. His words hadn't been clumsy or conflicted. They were rehearsed as if Chloe had handed him the script. That was when suspicion began to creep in. My husband wasn't a reckless man. He was careful with every detail, the kind of man who wrote reminders on sticky notes and double-checked them before bed. He would never leave me unprotected. Not after everything we had built. So why had Nathan sounded so certain? Why had Chloe smirked like a chess player announcing checkmate? The motel's silence became my crucible. I grieved my husband, yes. I grieved my son more. But in that silence, suspicion began to turn into something sharper. I asked myself questions I never thought I would. Was the will tampered with? Was this inheritance a clean truth? Or was it a lie dressed up in legal language? The longer I sat in that room, the more I realized my grief was being pushed aside by something else. Bigger. Not the wild, screaming kind, but the quiet, cold anger that settles deep in your bones and starts whispering. Find out. Don't let them bury you alive. I didn't know then what the truth would uncover or how far the rot went. But I knew this much. I hadn't just been pushed out of my home. I had been maneuvered. And if Nathan and Chloe thought they could write me out of the story, they were about to learn that I still had a pen in my hand. The motel room had become unbearable, so when my phone buzzed with a reminder of my husband's attorney, I decided I had nothing left to lose. I had avoided that call for days, afraid of what it might confirm, that Nathan was right, that everything truly belonged to him. But something inside me, the same quiet anger that had been hardening since the night at the dining table, told me I needed to face it head-on. So I dressed carefully as if armor mattered, and walked into the familiar oak-paneled office where my husband had signed every major decision of his life. The attorney, Mr. Whitman, was a man of deliberate words. He had been my husband's confidant for decades, the keeper of secrets I never thought I'd need to question. His handshake was warm, but his eyes lingered too long on mine, as if measuring whether I was ready for what he had to say. I told him everything. The eviction, the envelope, Nathan's confidence that I had been erased. Whitman listened without interruption, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. When I finished, the silence stretched so long I thought maybe I had been right all along, that there was nothing left for me but scraps. Then he cleared his throat and leaned back. "Linda," he said carefully, "your husband wasn't the type to leave you vulnerable. He prepared for possibilities others might overlook." I felt my heart stutter at the weight of those words. Prepared for possibilities. What possibilities? Whitman rose from his chair, walked to a locked cabinet and returned with a thick folder. He set it on the desk between us, and my pulse raced at the sight of my husband's handwriting on the seal. "This," Whitman said, tapping the folder, "is an addendum your husband instructed me to hold privately. A contingency clause. It wasn't meant to be opened unless certain conditions were met." My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a single document, the language crisp, formal, unmistakable. My husband had left behind more than a will. He had left behind a safeguard. The clause was devastating in its simplicity. If Nathan ever attempted to remove me from the estate or acted against my welfare, all assets in their entirety would revert to a trust in my name. My eyes blurred as I read it again and again. It wasn't just protection, it was foresight. My husband had anticipated betrayal, had known the possibility existed that his own son might one day put greed before blood. I whispered the words aloud, unable to believe them. All assets revert to Linda. $40 million reversed in a single stroke of ink. But the shock didn't stop there. The trust wasn't static. It was tied to investments my husband had quietly nurtured in a biotech company, one I had never even heard him mention. Whitman handed me the valuation report. "As of this quarter," he said softly, "the trust is worth approximately $45 million. 45. My breath caught. Not only had Nathan's claim been hollow, but the true value of the estate was even greater than what he had flaunted across the table. My husband had seen further down the road than any of us. He had not left me destitute. He had hidden the crown in a place only betrayal could unlock. And Nathan, blinded by arrogance, had either never read the clause or willfully ignored it. I sat back, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions: relief, grief, fury. Relief that I wasn't powerless. Grief that my husband had even felt the need to imagine such treachery. Fury that Nathan had lied so effortlessly, tossing me out as though the paper in his hands was the final word. Whitman folded his hands. "Linda," he said with quiet gravity, "there may be grounds for fraud. If Nathan knowingly concealed this clause or if Chloe encouraged him to act on incomplete information, we are not just looking at cruelty. We are looking at a legal violation. Fraud." The word hit me like a gavel. This wasn't just a matter of morality. It was potentially criminal. For the first time since that night, I felt the ground steady beneath me. Not completely, not yet, but enough to breathe without choking on despair. I asked him what I should do, and Whitman's eyes softened. "For now, hold on to this knowledge. Do nothing rash. I will begin reviewing the estate proceedings, but if Nathan acted in bad faith, we may need to involve law enforcement. Let them reveal who they truly are." I left the office with the folder clutched to my chest, the weight of it heavier than gold. On the sidewalk the world looked different. The same cars honked, the same people hurried by, but I was no longer the discarded woman with a suitcase in a motel. I was the hidden heir to a fortune my son thought he controlled. Walking back to that motel I thought about the irony. Nathan had gloated over $40 million like a boy showing off stolen candy, not realizing that the very act of trying to push me out had triggered the trap my husband had set. My husband had known him better than I wanted to admit. He had trusted Nathan enough to love him but not enough to leave him unchecked. And now that foresight had become my shield. In the dim motel room, I laid the documents on the bed and read them again under the weak lamp. Each line of legal text was a lifeline pulling me out of the quicksand. I could almost hear my husband's voice whispering from beyond, "I knew you'd need this. I knew they might try." The ache of missing him surged again, but alongside it came a new strength. He hadn't abandoned me. He had armed me. As night fell, I stared at the ceiling with a new kind of anticipation. The roles were already shifting even if Nathan didn't know it yet. He thought he had slammed the door on me. What he didn't realize was that behind that door, another had opened, and this one led to a truth far larger than either of them could imagine. And as the hours passed, a question kept rising in my mind, steady and insistent. What would I do with this knowledge? Because one thing was certain. The game had only just begun. I didn't sleep much after uncovering the clause, but this time it wasn't grief that kept me awake. It was adrenaline. For the first time since Nathan shoved that envelope across the dining table, I felt like I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing. My husband had given me a weapon in ink and foresight, and now it was my turn to use it. When I met Mr. Whitman again, his tone had shifted. He no longer looked at me with the pity people reserve for widows and mothers discarded by their children. He looked at me as though I were his client in full, the rightful heir to a fortune someone else had tried to hijack. He had already filed motions with the probate court to freeze any further dispersal of assets pending investigation. "Nathan may think he's in control," he said, "but the paper trail won't lie." Within days, the banks began responding to Whitman's inquiries. And what surfaced first made my stomach drop, then harden into certainty. There were unusual withdrawals, large round numbers that screamed of desperation, shuffled from Nathan's accounts into entities I'd never heard of. The names alone, thin shells registered in the Caribbean, were enough to set off alarms. Offshore transfers. He wasn't just moving money. He was hiding it. I sat in Whitman's office as he laid out the statements, the numbers circling across the page like evidence of a crime scene. "This isn't just reckless spending," he explained. "These are classic fraud signals. Structuring, layering, concealment. It looks like he's being coached." Coached. That word chilled me because I could already guess by whom. Chloe's family had always been a shadow at the edge of our lives, comfortable enough in polite company, but with whispers around the edges. Her uncle's consulting firm, that folded overnight. A cousin who had been misunderstood by tax authorities. Things Nathan always brushed off when I raised an eyebrow. And now it looked like those shadows were pulling him deeper than he even realized. Whitman didn't hesitate. He set up a meeting with a detective in financial crimes, a man with salt and pepper hair and a voice that was too calm for the weight of the words he carried. Detective Harris listened intently as we laid out the documents, nodding slowly, tapping his pen. "This isn't just a family dispute," he said finally. "This crosses into criminal territory. And given the offshore connections, we may need to loop in federal jurisdiction. The FBI has already had an eye on Chloe's extended family. This could tie directly into their casework." I felt my breath catch. The FBI? My story, my grief, my betrayal. It was suddenly a piece in a much bigger puzzle. Harris met my eyes. "Mrs. Walker, I know you didn't ask to be in this position, but you may be the key witness in proving a pattern. If you're willing, we can build an operation designed to catch them in the act." Willing. I thought about the word. A week earlier, I had been too numb to even protest when Nathan told me to leave. But now I felt a fire I didn't recognize in myself. "I'll do whatever it takes," I said. And I meant it. The next weeks blurred into a crash course in a world I had never imagined I'd touch. Meetings with attorneys, quiet briefings with detectives, whispered conversations about sting protocols. I was given a direct line to an FBI field agent, a woman with sharp eyes who radiated competence. She explained how financial predators operated, how arrogance was their weakness, how Nathan and Chloe would almost certainly trip themselves if given the chance. Greed blinds people, she said. They'll think they're untouchable right up until the handcuffs. The operation they sketched out was simple in theory, but nerve-wracking in execution. Authorities would let Nathan believe the transfers were still under his control. The bank, under instruction, would allow his next move to proceed just far enough to confirm intent. Chloe, they suspected, would be the one urging him to push harder, to prove himself in front of her family. And all the while the FBI would be watching, tracing every digital footprint, every whispered phone call. I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. Just days ago I had been cast out as a liability and inconvenience. Now I was sitting in secure offices as a partner to federal agents, my signature triggering account holds, my testimony forming the backbone of a criminal probe. Authority had shifted, not just in documents but in power. At night, alone in the motel, I'd replay the dining table scene in my mind. Chloe's smirk, Nathan's cold certainty. I would imagine their faces when the ground gave way beneath them. And though I tried not to, I sometimes allowed myself the satisfaction of picturing Chloe's carefully painted nails tapping anxiously against a table as federal agents showed her the evidence. But there were moments of doubt too. Nathan was my son. The boy I had once cradled, defended, prayed over. Could I really be complicit in bringing him down so completely? The answer came each time I pictured the envelope sliding across the wood, the dismissive words, "Find somewhere else to stay." He had already discarded me. This wasn't me destroying him. This was me refusing to let him destroy me. As the sting drew closer, the tension tightened like a wire. Every phone call from Whitman or Harris sent my heart racing. Every update from the FBI made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. And yet, underneath it all, I felt strangely steady. It was as though my husband's foresight had wrapped itself around me like armor, whispering, "You were never powerless. You just had to see it." Finally, one late evening I got the call. Harris's voice was clipped but controlled. "They've made their move," he said. "Nathan and Chloe are attempting to route a 7-figure transfer through a flagged intermediary. It's textbook laundering. We're moving to intercept. Stay ready, we may need you for confirmation." I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was happening. The son who thought he had written me out of life's script was about to discover that the story was still mine to tell. And as I stared at the motel's peeling wallpaper, one thought burned brighter than the rest. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you thought would stay silent. 48 hours. That's all it took. 2 days earlier, I had been the one standing small and silent in my own dining room, clutching an envelope of pity money while my son and his wife stripped me of dignity. Now the tables had not just turned, they'd flipped with a force I could never have imagined. It started with a phone call from Detective Harris early that morning. His tone carried a restrained satisfaction. "The accounts are frozen," he said. "Mid-transaction." He was trying to push a large sum through an offshore intermediary, but the system locked it before it cleared. He doesn't know yet, but when he finds out, the fallout will be immediate. I poured myself a cup of tea as though he'd just told me the weather. There was something profoundly grounding in the simplicity of that act. A chipped motel mug. My feet tucked beneath me. And yet, behind that calm picture, the foundations of Nathan's world were crumbling. Harris warned me, expect movement within the next 24 hours. Desperate people make desperate calls. We'll be ready. Sure enough, the cascade began. Whitman forwarded me messages he'd intercepted from business contacts. Angry emails, voicemails dripping with panic. Partners demanding explanations for missing funds. Creditors asking why transfers were bouncing. Deals collapsing in real time. And the cruelest irony? The very fortune Nathan had flaunted to shove me aside was now the quicksand pulling him under. The FBI had anticipated this. They had placed an operative, a friend of Chloe's family, in his orbit, a man with just enough credibility to dangle a lifeline. He whispered about cleaning channels, about a way to slip the blocked funds through a laundering scheme that would make the problem disappear. I didn't have to see Nathan's face to know how eagerly he would have nodded. Greed had always been his compass and desperation only sharpened it. Meanwhile, I sat in that motel serene in a way I hadn't felt in years. Every update from the agents felt like a balm to the wound Nathan had inflicted. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity. The universe was showing in record time that arrogance has consequences. By the second evening, precisely 48 hours after the night Nathan had tossed me out, I found myself glancing at the clock. The same hour. The same date. 2 days ago his voice had cut me apart. "Mom, this house isn't yours anymore." Now at that very moment the tables were turning in a way so sharp it almost felt scripted. A knock shattered the quiet. No, not a knock. A pounding. Fists desperate, urgent, the sound of someone whose world was collapsing around him. My chest tightened, not from fear but from the eerie poetry of it all. I opened the door and there he was. Nathan. My son. The man who had sent me out into the night with a suitcase was now standing on the other side of a motel threshold, disheveled, pale, sweat clinging to his temples. "Mom," he gasped, as if the word itself might unlock the door to salvation. "I need your help. Please." For a moment I simply looked at him. I thought of every sacrifice, every night shift I'd taken so he could have shoes that fit, tutors that charged too much, dreams bigger than we could afford. I thought of how Chloe had smirked as she handed me that envelope, how Nathan had looked at me with the indifference of a stranger. And now here he was, pleading. I didn't answer immediately. Silence stretched, and in that silence the power shifted completely. He fidgeted, eyes darting. "They froze everything, Mom. I can't get to my accounts. Chloe's family, they're turning on us. I don't know what to do." His words tumbled out, frantic, a far cry from the rehearsed certainty he'd worn just 2 nights ago. I leaned against the frame, the cool wood steady beneath my hand. "You told me to find somewhere else to stay," I said quietly. "I did." His face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw not a powerful heir but a frightened boy who had played a game far bigger than he could handle. "Please," he whispered. "You don't understand. They'll ruin me. I need you." And here's the thing, I did understand. I understood more than he knew. I understood that the FBI was already watching, that every frantic move he made was being logged, that the trap was nearly closed. I understood that I no longer needed his validation, his apology, his plea. I had already stepped into a life where my worth wasn't up for debate. Behind Nathan's desperation, there was a shadow of something else. Chloe. I could almost hear her venom in his ear, pushing him to salvage the money, to cling to the empire they thought they'd built. But now, stripped of wealth, of control, of certainty, he was simply my son again. My broken, arrogant, reckless son. I let him stand there, pounding heart against the thin motel air, while I weighed my words. Not because I didn't know what to say but because I wanted to feel the weight of this moment. 48 hours. That was all it took for betrayal to boomerang back. "I'll pray for you, Nathan," I said finally, my voice steady, almost tender. "But I can't fix what you chose." His mouth opened, closed like he wanted to argue but had run out of scripts. And then as the silence pressed heavier he stepped back. For the first time in years, Nathan didn't look like the man holding the cards. He looked like the one caught in someone else's game. As he turned away, shoulders slumped, I closed the door gently. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with certainty. Because while my son spiraled into the consequences of his choices, I knew something he didn't yet. The story wasn't over. The sting was still unfolding, and before long, the FBI would show him exactly how small his empire really was. I set my mug of tea back on the nightstand and exhaled. 2 days ago he had discarded me. Tonight he had begged. And tomorrow the world he thought was untouchable would collapse completely. When the FBI asked me if I was willing to meet Nathan and Chloe one last time, I didn't hesitate. Not because I wanted to see them but because I understood that closure doesn't come quietly. It comes when the truth is dragged into the light. The location was carefully chosen. A downtown coffee shop, ordinary enough that no one would suspect it was wired from floor to ceiling. I arrived early, ordered a plain cup of coffee, and sat by the window as agents blended seamlessly into the background, disguised as baristas and customers with laptops. Nathan and Chloe swept in 15 minutes late, Chloe leading the charge. She wore her arrogance like perfume, thick and impossible to ignore. Nathan followed, his eyes shadowed with the kind of desperation that can't be hidden. Chloe slid into the seat across from me, smiling the way a wolf might smile at a lamb. "Linda," she purred, "we don't have much time. Let's cut to the chase." She placed a stack of papers on the table, pushing them toward me with a manicured finger. "Sign these and we can make all of this easier. The trust your husband left you, it doesn't have to get messy. We'll take care of it, make sure you're comfortable. In return you just disappear." Her voice was syrupy but her eyes were knives. I didn't touch the papers. I just wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, letting the warmth steady me. "And if I don't?" I asked, my voice calm, measured. That's when the mask cracked. Chloe's smile faltered and she leaned in closer, her words dropping into a hiss only I was meant to hear. "Don't be stupid, Linda. You're alone. No husband. No real friends. You think anyone's going to believe your side of the story? We have the money, the influence. You have nothing." For a moment I let her believe I was cornered. I glanced at Nathan, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the silence. His hands fidgeted with the lid of his coffee, his jaw tightening as though he were fighting some internal war. Finally he broke. His voice cracked low, urgent. "Mom, please. Just sign. Chloe's right, it'll be easier for everyone. Besides, the will wasn't even supposed to be that way. I had to make some changes." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. I watched Chloe's head snap toward him, eyes widening in horror as she realized what he had just admitted. My heart hammered, but I kept my expression neutral. "Changes?" I asked softly. Nathan rubbed his temples, the guilt spilling out faster than he could stop it. I forged parts of it. Just enough to keep you from contesting anything. Chloe told me it was the only way. We didn't think anyone would find out." That was the moment the agents had been waiting for. Chairs scraped suddenly, sharp commands filled the air, and before either of them could react, half a dozen plainclothes officers closed in. Chloe's bravado dissolved instantly, her voice screeching through the cafe as they pulled her arms behind her back. "This is a mistake. You can't do this. We're rich, we'll bury all of you." Nathan didn't fight. He just sat there, pale and hollow as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. His eyes found mine, searching for some fragment of mercy, but I had none left to give. The betrayal, the lies, the cruelty, it all funneled into this moment, where justice wasn't just a word but a visible act. Patrons watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded, phones raised to capture the humiliation of a couple who once thought themselves untouchable. Chloe kicked and cursed until she was hauled outside, her shouts muffled by the car door slamming shut. Nathan lowered his head, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Mom." But the words meant nothing, not anymore. I stood, my knees steady, my back straight. As I walked past him, I felt lighter than I had in years. The woman who had been discarded like trash had just witnessed her oppressors brought down in broad daylight. And it hadn't required vengeance or fury. It had required patience, truth, and the belief that justice in its own time would prevail. When I stepped outside, the winter air filled my lungs like freedom itself. The flashing lights painted the street in blue and red, but for me it felt like the dawn of a new life. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. My son and his wife were in the hands of the law, and I was finally walking into the life my husband had made sure I still had. 6 months is both an eternity and the blink of an eye. That's how it felt watching the fallout of Nathan and Chloe's choices ripple through the world we once shared. The trials moved faster than anyone expected, mostly because the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the wire transfers, the offshore accounts, the recorded conversation in that cafe. It was a web so tangled even their lawyers couldn't find a way out. Nathan, my only son, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud and forgery. Chloe received 10, her previous family connections to financial schemes catching up with her at last. The same arrogance that once made them feel untouchable now made them unforgettable, in headlines that dragged their names through mud, dust, and disbelief. The mansion they flaunted like a trophy was repossessed. Cars, jewelry, vacation homes, all seized. What they had stolen, manipulated, or bragged about was gone, dissolved under the bright light of accountability. Their faces appeared on every news channel, not as glamorous heirs but as cautionary tales. Words like inheritance sting, family betrayal, and fraud scandal ran across screens in bold letters. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Commentators dissected their downfall with the same energy they might reserve for celebrity scandals. And in the middle of it all, one unexpected phrase kept following me wherever I went. Linda, the widow who fought back. I never sought that title, but I understood its power. Media outlets framed me as both victim and victor. A woman discarded by her own son, yet standing tall against deception. Interviews came quickly, each one asking me how it felt to be betrayed so deeply, and how I found the strength to fight. The truth was simpler than anyone imagined. I fought because grief and injustice, when combined, either break you or make you unbreakable. I chose the latter. With the settlement of my husband's estate, the hidden trust that had once been my private lifeline was now my public platform. $45 million. A number so large it had once felt abstract, almost unreal. But I didn't see it as a prize. I saw it as responsibility. My husband must have known that leaving me this clause, this safeguard, was about more than protecting me personally. It was about arming me with the means to create something lasting out of the ashes. So, I founded the Harbor Foundation for Elder Justice. The name came easily, because what is a harbor if not a safe place to dock after storms? I poured resources into shelters for older adults forced out of their homes, into legal aid for seniors preyed upon by greedy relatives or manipulative caretakers. I hired investigators who specialized in uncovering financial exploitation. I stood in rooms where victims trembled to tell their stories and said the words I had once needed to hear myself. You are not disposable. You are not alone. Every ribbon cut, every grant approved, every tear wiped away with dignity restored. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I had been humiliated in a dining room, shoved into a motel, stripped of my security by the people who should have been my safety net. And now I was turning that humiliation into fuel, proof that no betrayal, no matter how brutal, gets to define the rest of your story. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same media outlets which once chased Nathan and Chloe for photos of their luxury vacations were now chasing me for comment on my foundation's work. The spotlight had shifted, and with it so had the narrative. Their legacy became one of greed and disgrace. Mine became one of resilience and reinvention. At night, when the interviews were over and the applause from charity galas had faded, I returned to the quiet of my coastal home. It wasn't the mansion I'd once been pushed out of, but something far better. A house I chose, a place filled not with echoes of betrayal but with the steady hum of peace. My windows opened onto the sea, the air carrying salt and freedom into every room. Sometimes I'd sit on the balcony, tea in hand, watching the waves crash, each one a reminder that everything erodes eventually. Pain, power, even the walls built to contain us. It was there, in the stillness of one evening, that I allowed myself to think of Nathan without bitterness. A part of me would always mourn the boy I raised, the one I once believed would protect me as fiercely as I had protected him. But motherhood had taught me many lessons, and perhaps the most important was this. You cannot carry someone who insists on sinking themselves. What I could carry, though, was the message. The reminder that betrayal does not mean the end, that being discarded can become the beginning of something stronger. People reached out to me from around the world. Letters, emails, messages, telling me how my story gave them courage to confront their own injustices. Some spoke of siblings who stole inheritances, of children who abandoned them, of spouses who manipulated them. And in every note I recognized a reflection of myself. Someone who had been told they were powerless, only to discover a power they hadn't known was there. One evening, after a long day of foundation work, I wrote down the line that had been circling in my mind for months, the sentence that seemed to capture the truth of everything I had endured. He threw me out with nothing. But when the dust settled, I had everything, and a story louder than his betrayal. That line became the closing of my first public speech, and it has echoed ever since. Not because it's poetic, but because it's true. Nathan thought the $40 million made him untouchable, but it made him reckless. Chloe thought cruelty would silence me, but it sharpened my voice. And together they forgot that strength doesn't come from money or power. It comes from survival, from choosing not to break when someone tries to erase you. 6 months ago, I was a widow with a suitcase in a motel, wondering if my life had ended with my husband's last breath. Today I stand not just as a survivor but as someone who reclaimed her story and built a harbor for others to dock safely in. And if you're listening now, carrying your own secret grief or betrayal, I want you to remember this. Endings are rarely endings. Sometimes they're just the beginning of the chapter where you finally learn who you are.